Endurance Junkie podcast, episode 64. Hey Junkie, thanks for joining me on a new episode of the Endurance Junkie podcast, the show where I will be interviewing some of the fastest, smartest and most inspiring people active in the endurance world today. Jason Koop is the director of coaching for Carmichael Training Systems. He coaches a variety of endurance athletes, from beginners to pros, but he has a soft spot for ultrarunning and currently coaches elite runners like Timothy Olson and Bowman, to name a few. Jason, thanks for joining me today. Now, for those of us who don't know you, can you tell us a bit about yourself, your sporting background growing up, and how you ended up in endurance sports?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been a runner all my life. I ran when I was a teenager, starting out with kind of youth track and field before they even kind of offered it in the schools. Ran throughout, junior high school, college, and then post-college. And then my transition into coaching really started with a summer job that I had with the track club that I ran with in high school. And apparently I was one of the more mature ones of the group, or I was just the oldest, or by somehow or some happenstance of default. The coach there, the kind of the founder of that track club, gave me some responsibilities for managing practices and carting kids around from track to track and place to place and organizing meets and things like that. And it was really there where I kind of fell in love with coaching. And at the time, there was really no pipeline to become an endurance coach. There were, very few certifications to be found there, and they really just lied in the hands of the national governing bodies like USA Track and Field and USA Cycling and USA Triathlon. But if you weren't a collegiate coach, or if you did not have a job at one of those NGBs, there's really no way to kind of get into the industry. And so I followed that passion a lot just through the summer track club, and then somehow ended up stumbling upon an internship with the group that I currently work for, which is Carmichael Training Systems, or CTS, and really just kind of fell in love with coaching again. And the company was really small. I have no idea how they had an internship program or how they thought to have an internship program. There was like 4 of us in the office at the time, so 25% of the workforce was me, the intern. And this was back in 2001. And really ever since then, I've just kind of, risen through the ranks of the organization to where now I'm the director of coaching, and I kind of oversee all of the coaching and camp operations that we have, which include, 4 locations that we have around the country. Over 50 endurance coaches that's whose sole focus is working with endurance athletes, which is kind of incredible to me, since there was really no established pipeline for that, or no established industry for that when I first started doing that. And just a plethora of other types of all coaching based types of management and operation orientation things that I have to oversee.
Yeah. So where did you get your knowledge from then? Was it just from your own experience, and then got some training left and right? And how did your philosophy develop, and how has it changed over the years?
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting story too, because as I mentioned, there's no pipeline. So my educational background is actually in biochemistry and genetics. And while the school that I went to offered an exercise physiology degree, there was really no kind of tie-in to coaching. And so I initially got this biochemistry and genetics degree without a real clear kind of pathway out. And so I tried to educate myself everywhere. I had certifications from all of the national governing bodies at one point: USA Track and Field, USA Cycling, USA Triathlon. I went to oodles of, seminars, and, you kind of name it. I tried to get certified for it, but was never really satisfied with any of those educational opportunities and any of those educational pipelines, whether it was NGB certification or even my traditional academic background. And really what kind of turned the corner for me was starting to work for a company and developing a sphere of mentors. And what they really catalyzed in my whole coaching philosophy is how to take all of those educational pieces and weave them into a cohesive story that you can then present to an athlete. Because really, at the end of the day, coaching is an art where the science takes over from. You have to have an incredible platform of all of these different disciplines that lead into coaching, and that's everything from even some of my traditional biochemistry background I utilize, particularly in the on the nutrition side of things. But you have nutrition and exercise physiology and cardiovascular physiology and psychology and all of these different disciplines that you have to weave into to coaching. What I found is that you can build up all of those disciplines to the nth degree. You can have PhDs and all types of certifications in any one of those individual areas. But if you don't have guidance and intuition and mentorship to weave those into the practical aspect of actually working with athletes, it really stops right there. It really stops at an academic problem. And athletes are not academic problems to solve. They're human beings that are extremely complex. So it was really when I started actually practicing coaching that I started to develop a lot of the training philosophies and workflow and architecture that I've used throughout my career.
Mm-hmm. So it definitely changed a lot. I mean, there's so much research being done now at the field of physiology and all that sort of stuff. So definitely the things that you prescribe now or that you would present to an athlete now is totally different from something that you would present 15 years ago.
Yeah, well, I would say yes and no. I would say the amount of research and academic work has increased a little bit, but the access to that has increased a whole lot. We used to have to go to painstaking ends to try to find the right journals, the right articles, the right research, and distill those down. Now you can just go on Twitter. And if you have a very good knack at following the right physiologists on Twitter, you can get access to a plethora and almost too much physiological research. And so when I first started coaching, the proposition was twofold. Is one, we had to go and be very diligent on the research side and go and do a lot of mining and try to extract the research. And then we had to be the filter for, okay, which part of this research are we actually going to filter through and start to apply to athletes, and how are we going to apply that? And now it's much more of a filtering proposition because there's so much out there in the big sphere, and athletes are extremely well educated. Athletes want to succeed, and most athletes, they see, so-and-so posted this and such posted that. And then even in the popular magazines like Outside and Runner's World and Trail Runner, there's a lot of research that's repurposed into those articles that's easily consumed by athletes. So now from a coaching perspective, we've subtly shifted the focus onto that filtering mechanism and looking at all the research that's out there and really filtering it down to, okay, what's good, and then how do we apply it to the athletes? We don't even have to go look anymore because it's already all there.
Yeah. And it all depends on which athlete you have. I mean, it's so individual. So the stuff that you would propose to one athlete would not necessarily be the same thing as you would propose to somebody else. And
that's always been coaching, right? Coaching, one of the essences of coaching is you're taking standardized practice and you are customizing it for an individual, and you use different tools and different lenses to take that standardized practice and filter it down to an individual. It's not unlike medicine, right? I mean, all the health practitioners and doctors and orthopedic surgeons and physical therapists and things like that, they're doing the same thing. They're taking standardized practice and filtering it down to the level of the individual. And that's what we're doing as coaches, is we're taking standardized practice and research and trying to filter it down to the level of the individual.
Yeah. Is that like sport specific, or is that the same way of working for all your types of endurance sports? Like, would you train a trail runner for the same way as you would a triathlete, for example?
Yeah, well, the answer to that is yes and no. So you're going to get a lot of ambivalent answers from me. That's part of the nature of coaching. Is one of the most common responses to any questions is it depends, right? It depends on the athlete. It's really interesting that you mentioned that, and I'll kind of go off on a tangent that hopefully will be insightful for your listeners. Is when I first started taking over this management role at CTS, where I had oversight over all the coaches, where I had to hire them and train them, and I was responsible for the continuing education process and things like that. The standard run of show that we would take for any new coach is we bring them in, we make sure that they, were over a certain bar, they knew their stuff, and we felt that they had the right stuff to be a good coach. And then we would train them on how to coach any endurance athlete. So we covered all of the bases. We covered cycling and triathlon and marathon running and ultramarathon and ultra distance this, and we covered track cycling, and we covered everything. We covered all of the classic endurance disciplines and made them very, very, very broad. And then over the course of their career, what ends up naturally happening is they gravitate towards their strengths or what they like, and then they become an expert in whatever field that it is: mountain biking, Olympic distance triathlon, ultramarathon running, whatever it actually is. And we could do that because the whole coaching industry and coaching as a paid service was very juvenile at the time. Athletes would come in and they really didn't care whether their coach, was a cyclist or a runner or a triathlete, as long as they knew how to coach athletes, because the industry was relatively immature at the time. We could kind of get away with that broad-based approach first and end up with the situation of, okay, we have a running coach, and this is the situation I was in. We had a running coach, and I was predominantly a runner all my life, coaching cyclists and triathletes and mountain bikers and time trials and runners. We could get away with that because the consumers really didn't, the consumers really didn't know the difference, or the athletes really didn't know the difference. But really, over the past 4 or 5 years, we can't do that anymore. We have to bring in a coach for a very specific sport discipline, and whether that's ultramarathon running or triathlon or cycling, we have to bring them in for that very specific discipline, and then try to make them a little broad and get them really narrow very quickly across their development as a coach. So it's interesting to see how that's actually changed, and it's mainly from the athlete's perspective, where they're coming in demanding that their coach know everything about ultramarathon running or everything about triathlon, kind of right from the bat, because there are so many coaching options out there. In order to be competitive, you have to have that really narrow specificity across any particular sports discipline. So it actually is it is much more segmented than it has been over the past several years.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Well, because I got you on now, and yeah, you're a runner. Let's talk about ultra running then.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
You've written a book, Training Essentials for Ultra Running, and I think by many it's considered to be the go-to book when it comes to ultramarathon training. What makes training for ultra so different compared to training for a regular marathon?
Well, that's kind of why I wrote the book, is because there is an inordinate amount of coaching and advice and research and practice in training somebody for a marathon. I mean, you can go 1,000 different ways to find that. You can find online programs, you can find individual coaches, you can find, the local run group always has marathon training programs. You can look up a static program in, any one of the magazines. That practice is fairly standardized. It's only at the very, very, very elite level where you start to see very subtle nuances. And it's become rather ubiquitous. But once you went into ultramarathoning, what I found simply from a practice standpoint is it's all over the map. practice, just from a practical coaching application, was literally everywhere. People couldn't really, or coaches couldn't really decide on very fundamental things, such as, should we define volume by miles or by time or by miles in vertical or some sort of combination of those. We couldn't even come to fundamental consensus on some very basic things which had been relatively well established in other running disciplines under a marathon.
Is that just because it's such a new sport compared to marathon, which has been established?
Who knows? I mean, it is newer, but I would also say that just because fewer people have done it, there's just not as big of a market for it. And so the first piece of why it's different is there's nothing established. And that was when I first started working with ultramarathon runners, and this was 2003 or 2004, somewhere around that time frame. I was not an ultramarathon runner, right? I was a runner, but I'd never run an ultramarathon. And I took the same approach that I took with any other athlete that I had worked with, whether it was a triathlete or a cyclist or a marathon runner, is I first gathered some kind of background information on the athlete themselves, right? What they come to the table with, what their sport background is, what their training history is, all this kind of stuff. And then I would look and I would do an inordinate amount of research on the event itself. What are the energy demands? What systems are going to be taxed? How is the athlete going to be stressed? And then I would build a bridge between those two aspects. How am I going to ready the athlete that I'm now working with for all of those demands that I found? So I took that same approach with ultramarathon running. And what I found is I couldn't find all of those things that I could find in any other sport discipline. I couldn't find what the energy demands were. I couldn't find what systems were going to be stressed. I couldn't find any of these pieces that I would normally rely upon with any other sport. And so I largely had to make a lot of educated guesses. And that was the first piece of how I started to work with ultramarathon runners a lot differently than marathon runners. The second piece of it comes down to a really practical piece in terms of what are the differences between marathon runners and ultramarathon runners. Marathon running is predominantly it's an aerobic proposition, right? In fact, physiologists for years, and this has come out recently with the Nike Sub 2 project, have been able to predict what human performance can be at the marathon and 10K distance and things like that. And it's a relatively simple equation. And there are a lot of some of my college professors are going to cringe right now saying that it's very simple, but it's a relatively simple and elegant equation. And it simply states that the velocity that you can run at is a product of your VO2 max, so how big your aerobic engine is, the fraction of that VO2 max that you can actually utilize, and how economically you're actually using the oxygen that you can process. It's very, very simple, and there is an equation for it. It's F times VO2 max divided by the cost of running. And that has been used for a couple of decades now in order to predict human performance at the marathon. But what happens when you go beyond a marathon and into an ultramarathon types of situation is other factors start to play a contributing role in what performance means. And particularly the longer the event, the more that proposition is true. So you start to look at things like musculoskeletal breakdown, energy depletion, how well you can thermoregulate. And a host of other aspects that start to come into the fold with an ultramarathon runner. And so that fundamental proposition of I would train a marathon runner and I would use it predominantly as an aerobic proposition. We're trying to improve the aerobic engine. It becomes much more complex in an ultramarathon situation where you're having to look at a host of variables that are going to impact performance.
So is that the reason why you prefer to train your athletes by perceived effort instead of pure heart rate?
That's part of the reason. The main reason, though, is it's just a better gauge, and I used heart rate for years. For years. In fact, I developed our field test for running which would be a test an athlete could go out and do at any week, at any time, really simple 8-minute maximum test. And we would derive the various heart rate ranges from that test. That was one of the first things I did when I started coaching with CTS. And so I used that test and that range for years and years and years and years. And then once GPS technology became just more accurate and more adopted in the running sphere, and once power meter technology became more prevalent in the cycling realm, we started to uncover just a whole lot of flaws with using heart rate based training. And we kind of looked like idiots, to be honest with you, because we had this gold standard for years that we used to prescribe intensity, and that was heart rate ranges. And then once these better metrics came along to prescribe and analyze intensity, they made the earlier metric, which was heart rate, kind of look foolish, right? And so for years I said, yeah, train, between 160 and 165 beats per minute for this athlete, for this, type of training range. And then once we started using a lot more GPS technology or a lot more power meter technology on the bike, we'd go back to those heart rate ranges and go, wow, we were, in a lot of cases, we were really far off.
So yeah, that's a big difference between the standard marathon and then ultra marathons. Is there again another difference between a 100K and a 100 miler, or is that same approach?
Well, I would go even further. There's a difference between one 100K and another 100K. Even if you just look at the terrain profile or the temperature profile, or even the technical nature of the terrain, and even each individual. I mean, one of the interesting things about a marathon is the time frame for most marathon finishers is relatively small compared to an ultra marathon. If you look at, just take Leadville, which is kind of in our backyard, the winners will finish in 16 hours, 17 hours, on the men's side. But the last finishers won't come across until 13 or 14 hours later. And that's a long time to be out there, and makes the race way different, even though they're all running the exact same mileage on the exact same course. So I would honestly say that the demands are different depending upon all of those variables. The distance, the terrain, the technical nature, the individual, the temperature profile, all of those things kind of go into that aspect that I was speaking on earlier of what are the things that are going to stress the athlete out, or what are the things that the athlete is going to encounter and that they're going to have to prepare for in training.
Yeah. So what surprises me though with these ultra runners, I mean, guys who run marathons, they run like 2 or 3 a year. But these ultra runners, they run so many races. I mean, I've got an interview with Jeff Browning coming up. He just finished UTMB and ran Barrett 100 3 weeks later and won it. And guys like Killian, they run like every week. How can you explain that it's even possible for these guys to run so much when these ultra runs definitely are taxing the body so much?
Well, I mean, people do that in marathoning as well. I mean, the people do marathon after marathon after marathon after marathon. So I would say at the sub-elite level, that's not that uncommon, right? I mean, we put a lot of, emphasis here on the Grand Slam of ultrarunning, right? Which is for the oldest 100 milers in the U.S. and in a summer that are separated by just a few weeks each. But that's very common for, a lot of people to do in marathons, where they'll do one marathon a month or one marathon every few weeks, or, something like that. We tend to see it at the elite level, though, in ultramarathon running far more often than we do in marathon running. And a lot of that, though, to be honest with you, and with all due respect to all the great ultramarathon runners out there, is just that the density of competition isn't quite there yet. I mean, nobody can really honestly look at a marathon like the Chicago Marathon, which happened this weekend, the New York City Marathon, or the London Marathon, and compare that level and that density of competition that we see at those world marathon majors to any ultramarathon that we see, even UTMB this year, which was probably on the mid side at least the greatest, most competitive ultramarathon of all time. that doesn't even, that's a light years difference as compared to any of the world marathon majors. So a lot of it is just they can get away with it, and do those types of ultras time and time again. But also, I think, interestingly enough, there's a personality component to that as well. Ultramarathon runners or ultramarathoning tends to draw in like the extremes of people from a personality spectrum. And I think that's a lot of what you see kind of play out in these frequent, ultra after ultra after ultra type of event. Even so much so that I'm going and I'm crewing for one of my athletes that's doing the Moab 200, which now there's 3 200s in the United States, and she's actually doing all 3 of them, which wasn't even a thing a few years ago, right? And now this is all of a sudden cropped up as something that you could go and participate in, and there's several of them, these 200-mile races now. So it just tends to draw people into the sport that have a little bit more of that nature to them, where they just want to seek out the next challenge and do it more frequently.
Yeah, okay. Now, you recently wrote an article on the CTS website about the off season. It doesn't even look like these ultra runners even have an off season. But still, it's a pretty important part of the year. So what are the most common mistakes that you see these athletes make at that time of year?
Well, first is to call it the off season. I just hate that terminology. I know we take it from the league sports, football and soccer and basketball, baseball and things like that. But I always like to use the vocabulary transition phase. And the reason I really like that is because that's what we call all of the other components of training when you look at them throughout a year, throughout a preparation period, is we have, the XYZ phase and the ABC phase and the specialization phase and the speed phase, or whatever you call it, right? There are all of these different phases, and we use that word phase to describe a component of training or a period of training. But for some reason, for whatever reason, we don't apply that same vocabulary for the rest period that's in between events. We call it the off season. So I don't like that, simply because it changes the vocabulary, and I don't think it keeps a consistent mindset. I use a transition phase. I think that's the first mistake everybody makes, is they don't view it as training. They view it as not training. They view it as something else. But it absolutely is a critical piece of training when you look at the entire spectrum of the athlete. You have to take deliberate and focused rest, and in this case, it would be a phase of training, a transition phase, where you are intentionally not doing your primary sport, running, triathlon, cycling, or whatever. That's the biggest mistake most people make, is they call it the off season, and they don't look at it as part of an entire training program that should include deliberate rest. They get caught in this in-between area where they're kind of not training, but they kind of are training. And for most ultra runners, they're still running 8 or 9 or sometimes 10 hours a week, right? But they're not doing it with a whole lot of, focus. And so they're not training with a whole lot of focus, and they're not resting with a whole lot of focus. They're kind of caught in no man's land. And it's really not serving them many purpose, because they're not regenerating and they're not going forward. They're literally just kind of treading water and putting, in my opinion, unnecessary wear and tear on the body. So that's the primary mistake athletes make, is they don't view it as training. They don't take the deliberate, conscious decision of forced rest.
All right. Well, definitely hope that people take account there and definitely use the upcoming months for good transition into next season then. Thanks so much for your wisdom, Jason. One last big question. What do you see as your biggest accomplishment in your career so far, and what's your biggest disappointment or regret?
I would, on the accomplishment side, I got to say, building this network of coaches. It was something that didn't exist when I came into the industry, even so much so that we had to basically convince people that remote-based endurance coaching was a thing. Nobody really knew. Everybody had a preconceived notion that a coach was somebody like a basketball coach that was there on the court with them, things like that. And so to go from that to having this network of over 50 coaches who are fantastic, and many of these coaches you wouldn't know their names. They don't write articles in Trail Runner or Runner's World or whatever. But I will put any one of our coaches up against any coach out there without hesitation. They are extremely good at what they do. And every week when we get on our continuing education calls, whether it's with our Ultrarunning specific group or with our coaching group as a whole, I'm just floored at how good they are. So that by far has got to be the biggest accomplishment that I can really take a little bit of credit for, is just helping to build this network of professional, highly educated, very dedicated, and extremely good endurance coaches. I honestly don't know what to say on the disappointment or regret side. I feel like I'm channeling my inner Frank Sinatra with that line. I've always kind of coached with the philosophy that you either win or you learn. And so I've definitely made my fair share of mistakes on the coaching side and also on the administrative side. Most of them honestly come down to not really a technical aspect here or there, but it really comes down to communication. Whenever I've had athletes that have made mistakes, or we've made a programming error, or something's kind of gone wrong, you can always trace it back to the way that you've communicated whatever you're doing with a particular athlete. That's really hard, and I've always found that challenging as a coach, and it's a big part of coaching. You can have the technical architecture for a training program picture perfect, but if you're not communicating that architecture and those workouts and what the purposes of those workouts are to your athletes effectively, a lot of it gets just simply washed away. So that has to be, I would say, the biggest area that we've grown in, is just being able to communicate things better, both within our coaching group and also with our athletes.
Yeah, cool. No, you win or you learn. I really like that frame of mind. How can people get in touch with you if they want to, Jason?
Sure. Our website is trainright.com. We have all of our coaching packages and all of our camps up on that website. Also, we have the same Twitter and Instagram handle, so you can go and check that out. And we've also set up a promo code for all of your listeners. If you go and sign up for any of our coaching packages, either in October or in November, and use the promo code Junkie in all caps, and that's key. I don't know why we have to have all caps on these promo codes, but that's just a rule that our e-commerce site has. But if you use the promo code Junkie, we'll give you your first month for 99 cents, and I'll personally sign and send you out a book that you're referring to earlier.
All right, cool, awesome. Definitely put that promo code and all the links to your social media profiles on the page, on the show notes page. Feel free to give some love to your partners that you have there at CTS.
Oh man, we have some great partners. There are too many to list. I'm actually really excited about a new product that we're about to launch. It's called Endurance DNA, and we've partnered with this company called Helix. And they basically have a platform where you can have your DNA sequence just through a simple saliva sample, and we can take the information that comes from that genetic sequencing and provide insights that specifically apply to your endurance physiology. So how quickly or slowly you metabolize caffeine, how susceptible are you to any sort of injury risk, whether that's something on your Achilles tendon or even a stress fracture, and a whole host of other insights that we can look into based on that genetic insight. So I'm super excited about that particular partner, and it's kind of at the top of mind because that product's going to launch at the end of November. But yeah, a lot of partners. You can find them all at the bottom of our website, trainwreck.com.
All right, cool. One last thing. We finished the interview. You step out of the office and you find a lottery ticket that ends up winning $10 million. What do you do?
Man, I hope I get a better lottery ticket than $10 million, but I feel like I'm kind of greedy now that I say that. What do I do with that? Holy cow. I feel like I should do something like altruistic and like solve world hunger or something like that. But I'm a coach. I'm assuming the audience wants to hear something about endurance physiology or coaching.
No, not necessarily.
I'll lead in with that. But one of the problems that has plagued, and that's probably over exaggerating the problem. But one of the problems that we find in ultramarathon running is we cannot quantify workload or work rate very well. We can do it very easily in cycling with a power meter. We can do it really well in road running with distance and speed. But in trail and ultra running, there's really no way to quantify workload and work rate. And that's part of the reason why I use rate of perceived exertion to prescribe intensity. So if I could take that $10 million, and it would actually probably take that much if I'm thinking about it from like a startup venture capital perspective, if I could solve that problem of determining workload and work rate specifically in a trail running situation, I think that'd be a pretty good use of that lottery tickets money right there, and would probably pay back in terms of an investment. So I think that'd be a good use for that.
All right, cool. Thanks for your time, Jason. I'll let you go and have a look outside.
Absolutely. I'll try to find it.
Cheers, man. All right, thanks for listening to this episode with Jason Koop. As always, plenty of stuff to talk about with these elite coaches. I hope you guys are enjoying these chats and you're able to draw something from it. Now, if you're thinking of getting an online coach, make sure to check out CTS and use that promo code to get the first month at only 99 cents. You'll find the promo code and the correct link on the show notes page on the website, which is junkiepodcast.com. Now, if you like what you've just heard and don't want to miss any future episodes, please head over to iTunes or Stitcher and subscribe to the show. And while you're at it, and if you have some spare time, leave me a rating and a review as well. That would be awesome and will help grow the show. Alright, thanks again for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me next time. Cheers.